Defense leaders from around the world have been in Singapore this weekend for an international security conference. The Shangri-La Dialogue is Asia's foremost defense forum. This year's attendees included representatives from China, the United States, Australia, and Indonesia. The forum focused on security issues in the Asia-Pacific region, including tensions between China and Taiwan. There was also a surprise appearance from Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. It is only the second time Zelenskyy has traveled to Asia since Russia launched its full-scale invasion. Zelenskyy accused China and Russia of trying to disrupt an upcoming peace summit on the war in Ukraine. He said Beijing was pressuring other nations not to attend. Zelenskyy said more than 100 countries and organizations had signed up to the peace summit taking place in Switzerland this month and urged Asia-Pacific nations to join them.
We are disappointed that some world leaders have not yet confirmed their participation in the peace summit. Unfortunately, there are also attempts to disrupt the summit. We do not want to believe that this is a desire for monopolistic power in the world to deny the global community the opportunity to decide on war and peace and to leave this power in the hands of one or two.
DW's chief international editor, Richard Walker, has been at the gathering all weekend. Richard, thanks for joining us. So Zelenskyy seemed like the rock star of the Shangri-La Dialogue. He hasn't headed east much since the invasion of his country. Was it made clear from what he said why he felt like turning up in Singapore was important?
Yeah, well, I think there's a few things, Melissa. I mean, of course, ever since the war began, Zelenskyy has made it a major priority to try to drum up diplomatic support for Ukraine's position. And in the early phase of the war, of course, he did that always remotely from Ukraine. And then he started traveling internationally. But you're right, this is the only time that only the second time that he's headed to Asia. The last time was almost exactly a year ago. That was to the G7 summit, which was in Japan. And I was at that summit, and that was also, yeah, it also had almost this kind of quality of a rock star entrance, you know, into a summit that was mostly not necessarily expecting him to show up. That, of course, was an opportunity for him to meet G7 leaders. These are, of course, the rich, mostly Western powers, countries that are mostly on his side already. But what's an important thing for him is to try to win over countries that are either, you know, not committed to him at all or less committed. So, for instance, last year in Japan, he also spoke to Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India, who was attending the G7 summit as a guest, and that was seen as an important opportunity for him to get FaceTime with him. Fast forward to now, here in Singapore for the Shangri-La Dialogue, this was an opportunity for a couple of things. First of all, to meet regional leaders from here in Southeast Asia. You had important leaders assembled here, for instance, the incoming president of Indonesia, who he had a chance to meet with directly. There are all sorts of other major delegations from Southeast Asian countries here, from Singapore, from Malaysia, other countries around the region. And also, it gave him an opportunity to be in a context with China as well. And you just mentioned that in the intro. I think this is really interesting and quite striking that Zelenskyy pretty much for the first time was openly critical of China for a couple of things. First of all, for sticking by Russia, for being so supportive of Russia. And then secondly, for, as he is putting it, both not showing up to his peace conference that he is advocating for later this month, but also claiming that China was alongside Russia trying to persuade other countries not to show up either. And I think, yeah, this is a bit of a turning point with respect to Ukraine's attitude towards China, because although China, it's been pretty clear all along, really, has been very supportive of Russia in this war in terms of economic support, political support, diplomatic support. Ukraine has been cautious about criticizing China. I guess the reasoning really being
Richard,
hoping that they can try to get some kind of help from China. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, Richard, I think one thing is pre-invasion, the Chinese were investing a fair amount in Ukraine as part of its Belt and Road Initiative. And my sense was always that the Ukrainians had an eye to those dollars, those yuans rather, right, for reconstruction in a post-war scenario. But it looks like Zelenskyy is finally burning that bridge. Like you said, it's a turning point. And I would say pretty significant. Wouldn't you say that as well?
Yeah. Oh, definitely. And I think it's being seen that way here as well. That for the longest time, the Ukrainians tried to kind of hold open the idea that China might at some point be helpful in some way in this situation. For instance, China came out early last year with this, what they described as a position paper on peace for Ukraine. It was very much kind of tilted towards the Russian view of things, but the Ukrainians did not reject it out of hand. They were not sort of openly critical of it. They really tried to kind of keep the door open a bit. There was one phone call between Xi Jinping and Volodymyr Zelenskyy. After that, I think there's definitely disappointment there hasn't been more engagement from the Chinese with Ukrainians. But yeah, today you had Volodymyr Zelenskyy saying that Xi Jinping had promised him during that phone call that China would stay on the sidelines in this war and that it would not provide Russia with weapons. And you had Zelenskyy saying, well, okay, what we are seeing is Chinese elements. He wasn't really specific about what, but showing up in Russian weaponry. He did add that you see elements like components from other countries also showing up in weapons, but whenever that would happen, that the Ukrainians would then get in touch with those countries and say, hey, why is this component from your country in these weapons? But pretty much pointing the finger here at China, saying, okay, Xi Jinping made me a promise, and implicitly saying he doesn't feel that promise is being honored.
Now, you touched on this a little earlier. I want to dig a little deeper into this about his reception to an extent. I've wondered whether, he's turned up because there's been some Indo-Pacific skepticism of Ukraine's war efforts. Having formerly been based in Asia myself, there's certainly plenty of anti-Western sentiment in many, understandably, post-colonial countries, particularly in Southeast Asia. And there's been this feeling that the West has cared more about Ukraine than other conflicts in the world, and hence this subsequent resentment. Would you say you felt that vibe this weekend? I mean, we talked about Zelensky's entrance and how excited people were. Do you think Zelenskyy changed hearts and minds in Asia?
Yeah, well, it's hard to tell. Of course, the people who are here attending this summit are not necessarily representative of, ordinary people in countries around this region. You've got military people here, you've got diplomats, you've got really a kind of a slice of the elite. But it is absolutely a fact that there are, many people in this region, countries in this region, especially Muslim majority countries, which look at what's been going on in Gaza over the last few months and say that the Western, as they see it, toleration of civilian suffering in Gaza contrasts with Western outrage at civilian suffering in Ukraine. And it's very common to hear this expression of double standards. And this presents a problem for Ukraine, that this sense of Western double standards is kind of, is kind of being applied to Ukraine as well. Of course, although Ukraine itself is the victim of an invasion, and Zelenskyy, when posed a question about this today, insisted, we don't have double standards, saying that although he stands by Israel's right to defend itself against the Hamas terrorist attack of October the 7th last year, but that Ukraine still calls and has called upon Israel to abide by international humanitarian law in its operations in Gaza. Right. So Zelenskyy very much rejecting any sense of double standards himself. But like the accusation of double standards is not so much aimed at Ukraine, it's aimed at Ukraine's supporters, and it's aimed at this kind of sense that the international community is giving more attention to the Ukraine war than to the Middle East war. And that, of course, presents problems to him because his main priority is to try to resolve his crisis.
I want to switch now to the U.S. and China. Both had delegations, and U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin was president. So how'd that go?
Yeah, so, I mean, there are a couple of levels to this. Of course, I mean, this is really, even bigger than the Ukraine war. This is the big issue here in this region, is the deteriorating relations between the U.S. and China. And on one level, there was seen to be some progress in that Lloyd Austin, the U.S. Secretary of Defense, met his Chinese counterpart, the Chinese Defense Minister Dong Jun. They had it was said to be a 75-minute meeting on the first day of the conference here. And that contrasts to last year when there was no meeting between Austin and his then counterpart, who since was mysteriously removed from his job. So, and that, of course, was part of this kind of freezing contacts that happened over the previous couple of years that went back to the visit by Nancy Pelosi, the then House Speaker of the United States, to Taiwan, which enraged the Chinese. They shut down communications, and then there was another huge bump in the road when there was the alleged Chinese spy balloon that flew over the United States. The United States shot it down, and this caused another brouhaha. So there's a sense now that since November, when, you remember, Joe Biden and Xi Jinping met in California, and they kind of agreed to get communication back on track, that this was the next stage of that, a face-to-face meeting between the defense ministers, and that this is a very important part of reconnecting the two militaries, that they can communicate better, especially to avoid potential crises emerging in some of the hotspot areas, particularly the South China Sea, but also the Taiwan Strait.
Yeah, I have a question about that.
You wouldn't want, say, if a U.S. Navy ship, yeah.
I mean, was Taiwan present? Were there any Taiwan representatives, speaking of Taiwan?
No, there's no Taiwan delegation here, and that is, unfortunately, that is the reality of this kind of conference, that Taiwan tends not to have an official representation. And you feel this at the Munich Security Conference as well, that there's a lot of talk about Taiwan, but Taiwan is not in the room. And that was particularly striking in the speech by the Chinese Defense Minister Dong Jun, that he spent a long time speaking about Taiwan pretty aggressively towards the new Taiwanese leader, William Lai. And when asked a question about Taiwan, also just basically, filled time ranting for 10 minutes about Taiwan. So a real sense that Taiwan is a major issue. It's potentially the flashpoint that could trigger a world war, but no one from Taiwan here. And that speaks to Taiwan's sense of isolation.
Richard, we tend to just report on these security conferences, but just to put some historical context to this, and I think of those black and white videos of defense ministers' meetings in the interwar years. And for people tuning in, that's kind of what's going on here at Shangri-La Dialogue, at the Munich Security Conference. Government officials are meeting in most part to avoid escalation, to avoid war. So the question is, how would you grade this past weekend's performance on that front?
Yeah, well, I mean, there are a couple of levels to this. Like, the fact that that meeting took place between the Chinese and the American defense ministers, that is obviously a good thing. And you hear that from delegates here. Like, Southeast Asia, it would be the nightmare of all nightmares if the U.S. and China kind of accidentally slipped into war. So definitely people here are pleased that that meeting took place. But, I mean, you use the expression interwar years, and, I mean, I think, yeah, there's definitely a fear that that's could be what we're in here, that we're in interwar years, that there is a war coming at some point. And I did have that feeling a couple of times when listening to both of the defense ministers' main speeches. So it happens that Saturday morning you have the US defense minister speaking, Sunday morning you have the Chinese defense minister speaking. And there was a kind of almost a mirror image of the two speeches in some ways, in that both of them kind of talked about each other without actually referring to each other directly by name. So, and Lloyd Austin, the U.S. Defense Secretary, was talking a lot about we're building up relationships with allies here in the region. We're strengthening our position. We're supporting allies for kind of free movement and you know, to ensure stability in Southeast Asia, South China Sea, this whole region. Building up what they call this sort of lattice work of their alliances. And the unspoken part of it was all of this is because of you, China, because everyone is worried that you want to dominate this region. Then move to Sunday, the the Chinese defense minister was in full-on attack mode against the United States without saying the name of the United States directly, and talking about outside powers that are trying to create a bloc mentality, trying to create a new Cold War. And yeah, you really had a sense of the two big beasts, the two superpowers of the world, standing in front of this region and saying to each other, you are the big problem of this region and of the world. And I think everyone here is, on the one hand, you know, a lot of countries here, they definitely want the United States to help them avoid being dominated by China. On the other hand, they are very worried about a Cold War that could divide this region and could erupt into a hot war. So I think there's a really intense sense of discomfort about where the world is at the moment, and particularly about where this region is. And yeah, do I know whether this weekend's conference has raised or reduced the risk of war? I simply don't know, I'm afraid.
Richard Walker, thank you so much for joining us.